Listen, not the frantic crackle of battle, not the shouted orders of men or the thunder of engines, but a slow, patient quiet, the kind that is wait, as if the void itself remembers and keeps its secrets like a sleeping thing. In that quiet the Craftworld drifts, a slow cathedral of light and bone, a thing half remembered by the galaxy and half forgotten by time. It is not a ship in the way lesser minds speak of ships. It is an organism of architecture and will, spires and vaulted halls grown from wraithbone, veins of living wood sculpt that carry voices of ancient artisans, corridors that breathe with the soft push of the vacuum. From a distance it is a smear of silver and pale blue, an edgelit ribcage against the black. But up close the Craftworld is a world. Plazas folded beneath cantilevered gardens, halls that open into courtyards of hollow sky, sanctums that hold the concentrated light of entire ancestries. It moves with the deliberation of memory, yawing on a course traced long before the present listeners were born, and every motion is a hymn. The wraithbone walls hum. It is a low, constant sound, like a string plucked at the edge of hearing, and it runs through the bones of the whole place. In the sanctuaries, this hum threads through the air like a harp note, calm, steady, a tonic for sleep. Along the corridors it is softer, braided with the ghostly whisper of the infinity circuit, which keeps record not just of clocks and engines, but of thought and sorrow. Sometimes, in the quietest hours when the stars press close against the panes, one can hear the infinity circuit speak in 100 small voices, themselves not words, but images, impressions left like fingerprints on the skin of the Craftworld. The laughter of a child who long ago learned to shape wraithbone, the precise movements of a sculptor's hand as it carved a phrase of welcome into stone, the remembered cadence of an old song hummed by lovers beneath a sky that no longer turns as it once did. There is the faint scent, if scent is the right word, of ozone and starlight, as though the very air has been charged with the memory of lightning and the slow burn of distant suns. It smells of iron and old resin, of the varnish that once kept the great hollow-singing devices clear, and the incense that was burned in rites no longer observed. These scents are thin, like the last traces of a perfume on a veil. To the unaccustomed they would mean nothing, but to an Eldar they are notes in a symphony of recall. Each note contains a place, a time, a face. The Eldar move through this organism with the long-limbed grace of things grown in stately halls. They are not hurried. Haste is a human failing. Their steps are considered like brushstrokes across a canvas. Cloaks fall like liquid along shoulders. Helmets rest more as ornaments than protective gear. And their hands, long and capable, touch things with a reverence that borders on worship. There is a quality to them that the lesser races call beauty. Fine cheekbones, careful gestures, garments woven with constellations. But there is a deeper thing beneath the outward elegance, a brittle pride, an old and aching carriage of loss. They are ancient in the way that mountains are ancient, layered, folded, weathered. Time has given them a patience bred of necessity and a caution born from experience. But age has also left them fragile. Their culture is a palimpsest of brilliance and regret. Around their necks hang talismans whose meaning is older than history, and in their eyes there is the sheen of river water, clear but always carrying sediment. They remember things their descendants will not, and they carry those memories like wounds sewn carefully beneath fine fabric. One who knows the Craftworld well might say it is haunted. Not haunted in the childish sense, no restless ghost shrieking in the night, but stitched through with echoes and the unquiet residue of choices made in arrogance. There is always the faintest shadow that passes beneath even the brightest archways, the shadow of the fall. It is mentioned rarely, as one might whisper of a storm passed across the sea, and even then only in guarded metaphor. The story is never told plainly. It is a scar the Eldar touch sometimes with the gentlest of fingers, and then look away. For now it is enough that the listener senses its presence, a vibration under the hum, a darkened seam at the edge of a tapestry. Our narrator, then, is an old voice of the Craftworld, one who has watched long enough to make memory a profession. Not a loud herald, nor a war-singing bard, but a farseer in the muted sense, a keeper of small things, a reader of patterns in leaves and the slow turning of stars. He prefers the name most proper to his kind in private, but to those whose ears are simple, he will be called Sillen. He moves along the lined walkways with a staff that thrums at its tip, not with a sound loud enough to break sleep, but in a manner that resonates on the same wavelength as the wraithbone itself. When Sillen breathes, the Craftworld listens, and in the way his feet fall, the floor remembers the cadence of his ancestors. Sillen is not a hero of battles sung in the plazas. He is a patient mind, attuned to the sinews of what remains. He carries unwritten things in his hands, modest implements, spirit threads, vials of sand from planets that no longer exist. He moves through the living vaults as one walking among ancestors, pausing at alcoves where old tapestries are frayed, touching inscriptions with a thumb that trembles slightly, not from age but from the weight of recollection. He listens to the infinity circuit the way others might listen to a lullaby, with closed eyes and a readiness to be taught. Children of the Craftworld gather when he speaks, not because his words instruct like a schoolmaster, but because his tone is the tone of stories told at the edge of sleep. He begins softly. "There is only the silence between the stars," he will say, and the youngest of them fold into that silence like pieces of a jigsaw fitting into place. There are others who move through the halls with him, the spirit seamstresses who mend the fabric of the ship's living quarters, the stonecarvers whose chisels catch the light like small stars, the guardians who keep watch at the outer parapets. None of them lift their voices in the way of alarm. Alarm is for the rash. They prefer the patient preparatory rituals, the cleaning of weapons by hand, the slow polishing of helmets as if to commune with the faces that once looked out from them. They speak in rehearsed cadences, conserving emotion as a resource. A word misused is as dangerous as a crack in a hull, and yet there are small, human things lingering in their practice. Teacups that bear faint scorch marks from a stove fire long since extinguished. A child's toy whose painted eyes have been worn into a specific familiarity. Letters folded away in private shelves written in the hand of someone who would never return. These artifacts are tiny rebellions against erasure, proof that the Eldar are not merely pattern and ritual, but beings who loved, feared, and were surprised. Such things sit beside grander implements, rune staves, spirit stones in their carved matrons, the soft cages that hold the slumbering wraith constructs. And in that juxtaposition, the heart of the Craftworld is made plain. Beauty is kept beside function, memory beside machinery. The infinity circuit is a presence more than a device. It hums beneath the flooring like a great organ, storing impressions in a lattice of light and thought. At certain hours, when the ship turns its face to a particular star and the flux stabilizes, the circuit throws up images like a hearth fire throwing sparks. A festival on a world now gone, the last minutes of an artist as she set the last hook into a sculpture, a child splashing in a shallow pool with no knowledge of the doom to come. These images are not played for the living. They persist as a way to anchor the ship to its own past, to remind its people of who they were and what they might still be. The spirit stones, those small, polished gems, are kept in sanctuaries whose doors close like eyelids. They emit a cold clarity like moonlight bottled. The stones hold echoes of the dead, fragments of souls shaped and stilled to keep the living from vanishing entirely. They are a mercy and an indictment. Mercy because they spare the living the loss of entire generations at once. Indictment because each stone is a ledger entry against the debt of their existence. Sillen sometimes walks among the stones at night, taking his staff and letting light fall across the facets, listening to the faint murmur that leaks from them. The murmur is not wholly comforting. It is the sound of continuity that has become habit, and habits have their own hunger. When the wind moves through the outer terraces, it sounds like breath. There are gardens in which slender pale trees drink starlight like wine and lawns of lichen that give slightly underfoot. The plants are not merely decorative. Many are cultivars chosen for their memory-retaining properties, for they store more than nutrients. They store scent and pattern. The gardeners tend to them with a kind of reverence, as if the care of a single leaf is akin to the tending of a flame. At dusk, if dusk is still the right word without the old suns, the terraces give off a pale phosphorescence. The light is not bright, but it is steady and namelessly intimate. Under that light lovers sometimes walk, not speaking, and the hush between them is the hush of things that are both fragile and essential. There are places, too, that hold other sounds. The echoing of training courts where slender blades move with ritual precision. The hush of libraries where hollow chords purr quietly as if dreaming. The distant thumps of engineering where wraithbone is coaxed into new shapes by those who still remember the old processes. Even the forges sing, though their song is lower and more methodical, less a hymn, more a breathing machine. Everything in this place tends to cadence and balance, a symphony practiced for generations until the movements become instinct. The effect is one of deep, enforced calm, and yet, despite the gentle order, there are hints of unevenness, tiny frays along the hems of ceremonies, a silence where once there would have been music, the occasional faltering of a light that does not return at once. Sillin notes these things with an attention that is almost tender, and then writes them down in the register kept under his staff. Some of these notations he files away under polite headings: ecological recalibration, inflation of spirit stone demands, and others he keeps in secret, scalar ticks in a ledger labeled with a name few others know. He does not sound alarm because alarm changes the pitch of life. Instead he listens, and the listening makes him wise. It is wisdom, in part, that keeps the people of the craft world from breaking. Their culture has become an architecture of small mercies, modes of behavior that seal off grief with care rather than denial. They teach the young to work with pattern and to honor the dead with quiet rites rather than with fireworks. They say that loud declarations attract unwanted attention. Theirs is a survival of soft things, memory preserved in lacquered boxes, grief spoken in slow cadences, hope folded and stored like a thin cloth ready for patching. This restraint gives the Eldar their awful dignity and gives the craft world its fragile coherence. And somewhere in the slow turning of all these rituals, in the hush of the terraced light and the slow eloquence of wraithbone, there is the sense that something else watches, not with eyes that burn or with mouths that hunger, but with a patient attention older than their architecture. It is the residue of those choices, that great, nameless consequence that the Eldar keep at bay with art and prayer. For now it remains a shadow, a negative space at the margins of their lives, shaped like a question. Sillin will not name it. He will not pin it like an insect beneath glass. He prefers the question to the answer for the time being, because questions keep movement in the mind and answers too often harden into fate. So the craft world turns. Its hum threads through sleeping quarters and study halls, past spirit stone sanctums and the quiet of children dreaming under lattice canopies. The infinity circuit whispers its small, fractal memories. The people move like living music through halls of bone and light. And above the high domes the stars go on, indifferent and silver, keeping their own counsel as they have since before this story began. Sillin pauses in a courtyard where the air is warmed by the faint glow of a faithful lamp. He lays his palm on the wraithwood of a bench, feeling the residual pulse of a maker who lived 3 centuries ago. He breathes in the scent, iron and varnish, a hint of something like lavender, and for a moment the craft world seems to exhale with him. He sits, and his voice lowers as if to the very fabric of the place. There is only the silence between the stars, he says again, as the children listen and the old ones close their eyes. He tells them not a tale of great battles nor of doom unmeasured, but of small things, the way a particular leaf once shivered in a lesser wind, the precise shape of a smile worn by a friend now turned to memory. He speaks in slow strokes so that the mind can follow, for the first purpose of this story is not to startle but to settle, to make heavy the eyelids, to fold the audience into the same rhythm the craft world keeps. And as he speaks, the listener feels an ache that is almost like comfort, a knowledge that they belong to something older than themselves, and that to belong is to be both sheltered and accountable. The notes of the infinity circuit thread through his words, a soft chorus underneath his voice. In that chorus there is a hint of something else, not yet named, only felt. It is not yet a terror. It is the whisper of a question. It is the shadow of the fall, distant as thunder. It is, finally, the promise that even this calm is held on the edge of an edge. For now, though, there is only the Craftworld, the hum of its bones, the whispering circuit, and the small, steady voice telling the tale. The stars watch silently. The ship breathes. The Eldar remember, and the night holds them as night always holds children at the edge of dreams. There was a time when the stars were not indifferent. They were canvases, and the Eldar were artists who painted on the sky. Speak of them at the length necessary, and their achievements tidy themselves into staggering images. Worlds turned into gardens, suns harnessed as pale lanterns for floating promenades, empires built on the patient patience of artisans who measured ages as other people measure breaths. They were a people who shaped suns and sculpted worlds. The phrase is not hyperbole, but the matter-of-fact truth of a civilization that bent the very architecture of light and matter to its will. Cities perched like filigree on the backs of ringed worlds. Fleets moved like circlets of pearls across the gulf. Their craft was not merely of tools and engines, but of feeling, of nuance. A civilization that made an art of restraint and a religion of refinement. It is easy, then, to speak of their beauty as though it were innocence, to look at marble and wraithbone and say, simply, that these were the marks of an aesthetic people. But beauty in the hands of the Eldar had teeth. Their sculptures were not mere homage to form. They encoded grammar of power. Their music did not merely soothe, but ordered social reality. They practiced perfection not as one might practice an instrument, but as one might practice dominion. To be Eldar was to feel one's life as a continuous composition. Everything, craft, ritual, love, was deliberate, curated, elevated. Out of such extraordinariness grew a dangerous conviction. Where others saw gods in nature, the Eldar learned to make gods of themselves. Hubris took root not through a single arrogance, but through 1,000 small triumphs. A culture ever tightener on its own cords of excellence, until those cords became a noose of certainty. We are the measure, they would whisper in halls of polished bone. Not out of false modesty, but as certainty. Their acts were not merely great, but the rightful summation of the cosmos taste. They believed, softly and then loudly, that where other species were raw material, they were the artists and stewards of meaning. They began to hold themselves as curators of the universe's finer aims. They believed, in the way that empires believe, that their refinement made them inherently separate, unchallengeable custodians of beauty, of the very ideal of refinement. Power and art braided into an intoxicating economy. Pleasure and achievement became indistinguishable. What had begun as an ethic of excellence became an appetite for a particular kind of sensation, the feeling of receiving the universe perfectly on one's terms. Salons and synods sang in rising chords of praise for ever finer nuance. Galleries of sensation opened where the rarest experiences could be shared, catalogued, and elevated. The Eldar loved exquisiteness as if it were oxygen. They refined desire into a taxonomy. They trained pleasure into ceremony. And in refining it so, they created a reservoir of psychic resonance more potent than any ritual they had formerly known. If one could name the axis about which the fall turned, it would be this: the transformation of desire into hunger so precise and intense that it became its own kind of weather. It did not arrive with thunderous fanfare. The universe does not always announce the death of a people with drums. Instead, the change began as a tightening, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Small things shifted in degree. Laughter that once warmed a chamber became a prolonged note. A beloved touch lingered until it altered the heart. The thrill of influence lengthened into an appetite for being the focus of the entire cosmos. The Eldar's habits of celebration, of exquisite attention, became conduits for something else, an amplification of sensation to the point where sensation no longer served the self but consumed it. Then the scream came. Not a screaming of bodies, but a psychic scream that rippled outward through the latticed minds of the Eldar like a stone dropped through the quietest pond. It was less a moment than a tidal turning, an exhalation so vast and so concentrated that the fabric of psychic space tore. Call it the fall if you must, though that word flattens what cannot be reduced to catastrophe alone. It was both revelation and annihilation, a recognition and a wound. The Eldar's collectivity of pleasure sharpened, amplified, practiced, coalesced into an intelligence of sensation whose emergence was violent in its subtlety. Minds that had been trained to savor perfection, instead set a standard the world could not match. And so, the act of desiring itself reversed, ceased to be a horizon and became a void that needed to be filled. This new thing, this hunger, was born of their joy, their lust, their perfection. It was not the sinless consequence of a single indulgence, but the inevitable apex of millennia of refinement. Where they had once molded the shape of a world, now the shape of the world began to mold itself around their need. The scream was heard by the warp, and the warp answered with a name that would become legend and curse. Slaanesh. Speak of Slaanesh carefully. Name is never an innocent thing. In their own tongue, the first whisper was a syllable that tasted of velvet and poison. To those who would name her later with harsher human words, the Prince of Excess, she who thirsts, these names would convey the moral of a tale rather than the catastrophe of an event. For the Eldar, the recognition was worse than the naming. They perceived, in an instant that extended like a razor, their desires reflected and sharpened and returned as demand. Something in the psychic air had learned to receive their passion and to feed upon it. Joy became the raw material of a predator. Gradually, as if a light had been turned low, the culture they had honed began to corrode from the inside. Each melody now held an undercurrent of lament. Every sculpted face seemed to echo an absent one. Rites that had once tethered them to meaning were recolored with the hue of temptation. The music halls that once trained collective resonance into harmony now thrummed with a pressure that tightened the lungs. The same hands that had carved worlds now trembled with an unnamed shame. The very tools of their refinement, ritual, art, beauty, became the conduits by which their undoing whispered into being. Do not imagine the change as uniform. The Eldar are, by temperament, subtle and distributed. Their fates unfolded in 1,000 personal tragedies as well as in public collapse. Some, with eyes like winter glass, saw the ominous outgrowth and fled into a Nile of sensation. They surrendered fully, becoming instruments of indulgence whose lives ended as empty shells. Others, more common, recognized a sickness and sought cure. It was the latter who invented the great, sorrowful engineering that would follow, the Craftworlds. The Craftworlds were an answer and an exile. If the Empire had been a magnificent spread of living cities and interlaced cultures, then the Craftworlds were concentrated refuges, vessels of exile adrift in a sea of guilt. Imagine converting entire worlds into ships, cities grafted onto hulls, temples cradled within wards, and launching them to wander the cosmos like slow, penitent islands. The Craftworlds preserved a portion of Eldar culture, but they also were a confession forced into material form. To build a Craftworld was to accept that you could no longer remain where your pleasures had been born. To leave one's home was to acknowledge the culpability of the whole. These vessels carried the best and the worst of the Eldar. On board, artisans continued their crafts with a grief-struck exactness. Poets refined elegies into art forms, and engineers maintained the bones of the ship with loving hands. But with craft also came discipline. New rituals were designed to blunt desire's sharpness, to reroot it, to bury it beneath layers of ceremony. Spirit stones were fashioned and sanctified, tools to entrap and steward the essence of the dead, so that life might not be utterly devoured. The Infinity Circuit, an architecture of memory and restraint, was carved into the hull, an operating system of caution that held the ship's collective consciousness in 1,000 small cages. These vessels became, in effect, moral laboratories, societies that had to invent perpetual containment strategies to survive. Whole professions arose around the task: guardians of denial, weavers of ritual, wraith conductors who managed the tense coaxing of the ship's living bone. And yet, even as they acted with the utmost caution, the craft of exile bore its own sorrow. To persist was also to remember. The Craftworlds could not unmake the aesthetic archive of the Eldar's past. That archive tracked the path of the people like a ledger. Every piece of music recorded, every tableau preserved, became a potential point of return for the hunger. Memory itself could serve temptation. Thus, even as they sailed away from the sites of their greatest sins, the Eldar carried their history with them, and that history had become heavy. Their culture hardened in response. Where once exuberance had been the energy of creation, now restraint became the highest design. Elegance, that old weapon, was now redeployed as a girdle, a containment. Each act of beauty was practiced as a liturgical suppression. Even lovers courted with measured touch, lest an honest caress ignite a chain reaction of longing that could not be quelled. There is something deeply tragic in the image of these exiled vessels. Picture a fleet of cathedrals adrift, each a microcosm of civilization, each a memory box of an empire that had once spilled across the stars. They are both refuge and prison, a paradox embodied. Salvation ashore, exile at sea. Their surfaces gleam, and yet their veneers hide an anxious caretaking. Wards and sigils stitched beneath the filigree, ritual chains running like veins. The Craftworlds became instruments of survival, because celebration had become perilous. And within each Craftworld, the social order rearranged itself too. The old cults and orders that had been centers of creation now often functioned as controllers of threshold. The seers, who had formerly read futures for policy and planning, took on the darker duty of policing the subtle lines between appreciation and hunger. The artisans who had invented entire new languages of feeling became conservators, tasked with rewriting tradition as a means of defense. The leaders, Farseers, spirit seers, were the ones who balanced memory and interdiction, guardians not of triumph, but of the thin line between endurance and collapse. Yet even restraint can hide its own moral rot. For every innovation designed to calm, there were practices that skirted the edges of compromise. Some elders in private discovered that they could simulate depths of feeling safely, artifice instead of experience, until simulation and reality merged in dangerous contiguity. Other minds took refuge in techniques that dulled life into a gray middle, forms of aesthetic anesthesia that made living bearable but thinner. The very ingenuity that had once elevated them became an instrument of a quieter ruination. And through all this ran the deeper cruelty of the warp's echo. Slaanesh did not perish because the Eldar fled. She learned to interpret the roots of memory the Craftworlds carry. She was not merely a force that consumed immediate sensation. She became a patient intelligence that studied the archives, tasted the preserved voices, and learned how to whisper again into the edges of those memories. The exile's ledger became a roadmap for return. Memory itself was a vulnerability. It is a lesson cruel in its simplicity. Memory preserves identity, but also preserves the patterns that birthed vulnerability. This is why the songs of the Eldar grew more plaintive as time passed. Each melody preserved a color of experience and thereby kept a conduit open. Each sculpture that seemed a tomb was in truth a siren, beautiful and dangerous, an unintentional map. Art did not cease to be art. Rather, it was recontextualized as instrument and threat. The same hands that had once coaxed joy into brilliance now learned to shape lament into armor. Perhaps the greatest cruelty of all was that their punishment was not externalization into ruin, but internalization into vigilance. They preserved continuity at the cost of a continuous watching, an unrelenting self-scrutiny which, by its nature, feeds anxiety. Imagine a society in which every pleasure is weighed and measured, lest it open the door to oblivion, where children are taught to appreciate the geometry of form, but also taught, with equal care, how to avert eye contact that lingers. Such instruction preserves lives while also hollowing them of certain spontaneities. Joy in such a world became a scheduled commodity. And yet, the Eldar were rarely simple enough to be only victims. Their culture still shone with small resistances and defiant beauty. There were poets who composed laments that became medicine, sculptors who embedded within their work subtle negations that prevented psychic resonance from being complete, guardians who, in the empty hours of the night, stood atop parapets and sang defiant fragments of the old world into the void. Small mercies, an unplanned laugh, an illicit painting, an embrace that slipped past regulation, reminded them of their capacity for transgression and therefore for being human. Those moments were dangerous and precious in equal measure, but the weight returned. For every small rebellion, there was the inevitability of consequence. Even the most careful ritual has a frictional loss. In a culture of containment, those losses accumulate. The Eldar learned to cherish fragments of joy while watching the spaces that framed them. They became scholars of the smallest pleasures, knowing how to hold them for a single breath and then let them go before they liquefied into need. Thus the Craftworlds sail on, their fabrics taut with grief and guarded with technique. They are movements of exile and preservation, of stubborn artistry and sorrow. The Eldar, those who remain true to the Craftworlds, are defined by this tension, an impulse toward perfected expression, and an equal impulse to guard against that very perfection. And beneath the surface of their ordered days, beneath the careful cadences, there is a sound like a cooling bell, the warp's memory of that first scream. It is faint, almost always, but it is there, threading through the melodies like a note out of tune, and sometimes in the quiet between ritual and sleep, the whisper grows and the discordant echoes become audible, discordant whispers, like the distant scream barely audible beneath calm narration. A reminder that the hunger which birthed Slaanesh has not been erased. It has only been confined, waiting in the places where beauty and memory meet. Not because small things are unimportant, but because on a craft world the small things are everything. The measured folding of a robe, the precise placement of a spirit stone in its cradle, the way a child breathes when taught to count their heartbeats against the hum of the hull. Life aboard a craft world is a composition of rituals, each one a chord that prevents the entire song from unraveling. In the mornings, long before the plazas filled with those who performed the day's work, the sanctuaries woke in a whisper, wraithbone creaking like an old harp, the infinity circuit sliding into a soft dawn speech, the breath of the ship moving as if it were merely stretching after sleep. The sounds were intimate and everyday. The scrape of a broom across a courtyard of lichen, the soft click of a lock sealed with ritual precision, a measured footfall beneath an arch. These were practices of preservation as much as of beauty. The elders taught children the meditative journeys that coaxed their minds into forms easy to store and hard to be consumed. In the cool of the memory rooms, the young were guided through visions of geometry and pattern, learning to trace their wants into contained shapes, less a renunciation of feeling than its architectural translation. One learned to love in such a way that love would not bloom into appetite. One learned to admire without making that admiration a hunger. The infinity circuit regulated these practices, a lattice of light and suggestion that turned emotion into ledger entries, that buffered exuberance with calculation. Its pulse was soft and ceaseless, like a second heartbeat for the ship itself. The infinity circuit was both a sanctuary and a courtroom. It hummed beneath the floors and behind the murals, taking impressions and locking them into glassy matrices of memory. It could be coaxed to display an image of a day long past, a festival under triple moons, a sculptor finishing the last hair of a statue, so that a lesson might be taught or a lament rehearsed. But it did not merely show, it integrated. It took the pattern of a mind and formalized it into a node of the collective. In times of calm, this was miraculous. a family history preserved, a technique saved from being forgotten. Under strain, it was dangerous. The circuit could bind a tendency too tightly, make a craving structural, turn an instinct into a rule that then fed the thing it sought to deny. Alongside this living machinery lived other, darker preserves, the sanctums of the dead. Spirit stones, polished, hard, and cold as starlight, sat in shallow nests beneath glass. At a glance, they were as beautiful as any jewel. Closer, their surfaces were a map of trapped light. The stones held the echoes of those who had died. Not whole selves, perhaps, but shards, memories like thin films, voices caught in a loop. Bound in crystal, the teachers said, forever awake, forever whispering. It was a mercy and a mercy's cruelty. The living could speak to the dead through the stones, borrow their counsel, hear their cautions. But each consultation took a price. The living became used to hearing answers that were not alive. The dead became a chorus that insisted on replaying their own deaths. There were strictures around the stones, times for consultation, wards to prevent overflow, threads of ritual that prevented a grief from unspooling into want. Yet even the best wards could fray. The stones, after all, were repositories of vivid sensation. They were not merely repositories of knowledge. When an old poet's final sigh was caught inside crystal, it came back as an ache so specific that those who touched the stone could feel the exact temperature of the poet's final breath. The circuit's calm could be overcome by that specific ache. Patterns that had been carefully taught to the children might find themselves broken by the flood of a memory too bright to be dimmed. Such floods had a quality like a thin, high ringing that began far away and then came nearer, an echo of the first scream that birthed their exile. The warp remembers, and the warp keeps what it remembers. She who thirsts does not sleep because the echoes of need feed her. The elders spoke of that hunger in muted terms, a constant threat, an ever-present contour to life. They called her she who thirsts in voices tempered with caution. In private, older names slithered through their memories like old silk, names that tasted of velvet and loss. You could live a lifetime and never see the Force as a thing with claws. The horror is subtler than that. It is a corrosion that works by song and reflection. It is the way an old melody, practiced 1,000 times as a refrain for grace, begins to line up with a memory of an indulgence until the melody itself aches in a different place. It is the way a lover's hand, held in careful ceremony, lingers in the mind like a hinge. The rot takes the form of tiny misalignments that multiply, an extra beat in a hymn, a moment held too long in a sculptor's gaze, a pattern that repeats until it becomes an insistence. These are not poetic metaphors alone. There were concrete signs, wraithbone constructs whose edges blurred at unexpected points, hollows that, when called upon, showed a reflection that moved a fraction of a second too late. At the edge of a polished basin, a child might look and see, for an instant, her own face overlaid with someone else's. An old aunt who had once died in the flames of a pleasure hall. In the library, a lector might glance at a mirrored wall and see the movement of a hand that was not his own. The infinity circuit, for all its guardianship, sometimes threw up images that were not its to show. Reversed echoes, whispers played backwards, the rhythm of a heartbeat transposed into a static hiss. These things were small, and so the elders learned to treat them as small, an aberration to be recorded, an anomaly to be smoothed away, until the sum of small things could no longer be smoothed. And there were those who heard other voices in the circuit, voices that should not be. The infinity circuit was not merely a recorder, it connected. It connected to the web of craft and to the web of mind. When the warp was quiet, the circuit sang like a chorus tuning. But when the warp remembered the scream, the circuit sometimes caught the tail echo, a thread of pitch that was not Eldar in design. The guardians who policed data flows would find irregularities, a line of a song that repeated in half a dozen recordings, a motif that insinuated its way into lullabies. They would excise it, coordinate with sigils, and in the night the motif would lace itself again into ceremonial pieces, softer, disguised as nostalgia. Enter Scylla, Our Farseer, our weary spirit in a robe of pale weave. He is not young. He wears the lines of memory as carefully as one might wear a ceremonial sash. Not for show, but because each line marks a time when a small thing was noticed and noted, and then added to the ledger. He walks the ship with a staff that vibrates at the same pitch as the infinity circuit, a low complementary tone that makes his presence felt in the bones of the place. He is careful with words, with gestures, with consults. Where a younger seer might cast a coil of prophetic sight like a net, Sillin weaves his vision as a seamstress might weave thread. Fine, slow, with knots that hold without constricting. Sillin's powers are not spectacular in the way bards or warlords prize spectacle. His gifts are the measured ones, an ability to feel the edges of a day's pattern, to detect the softening of a ritual's discipline before it becomes dangerous, to read the infinitesimal changes in the infinity circuit and thus in the ship's mood. He has made a profession of watching what others overlook. He reads the circuit as one reads a book's margins, finding notes that have been scrawled in the spaces between the lines. Lately, however, Sillin's margin notes have grown crowded with oddities. The circuit returns echoes that do not fit, spirit stone murmurs that seem to answer questions not asked. Children who, in their sleep, repeat phrases of a song they have never been taught. The guardians who bring him such reports do so with the care of those who hold a fragile object. It is small, they say. We contained it. They do not always meet his eyes when they speak. There is a tacit admission in that avoidance. Containment is the job, but containment means waiting. Waiting is dangerous. Waiting is a kind of permission. Sillin's nights have become crowded with half-imagined images. When he enters the sanctum of the spirit stones, he feels the cold clarity of the gems like a breeze across his palms. He moves from stone to stone as if checking the pulse of a patient, and the murmurs that leak from them sometimes come in overlapping tongues. Counsel, complaint, a request. The dead are not silent. They are not even always patient. Some of them are anxious, their echoes bright and sharp because their passing had been sudden, unfinished. Sillin knows, better than most, that the dead can become a chorus that pulls at the living's composure. He knows that each consultation is a small attrition. On a particular night, one among a sequence that blends into his ledger, the circuit threw up an image that would not settle. He had been compiling a list of ritual recalibrations in a study lit by slow-burning lamps. Minor adjustments to a lullaby, an extra ward round at dusk, a new policy on spirit stone consultations. The circuit, which usually presented such things with obedient calm, flickered and then unspooled for a single breath, a set of images he had never requested. A woman at a balcony, the curve of her neck illuminated by a lamp, the silver of a goblet at her lips. The image lingered just a fraction longer than it should and then fused with another. The same neck, the same goblet, but now the skin beneath looked wrong, thin at the edges, as if stitched. Sillin felt a physical recoil in the bones of the ship, as if the image had made a tiny scar upon the circuit itself. He sought the traces, of course. The infinity circuit keeps logs like any device. It records not merely what is shown, but how long an impression lingers. He followed the strands back and found an insertion, an import, a motif that had been embedded in a dozen unrelated files. Whoever or whatever had first introduced it had done so with exquisite artifice. The motif mimicked the curve of a popular lullaby, matching harmonics so precisely that it would slip past coarse filters. Only a careful ear, Sillin's ear, could detect the microdiscordance. It was like a blade with a hair-thin nick. He isolated it, wrapped it in a ward, and sent the file into the slow furnaces where corrupted data is burned. That should have settled it. The guardians nodded. The engineers closed the case file. But a week later, a child in the North Terraces began to sing a line of the same motif in his sleep. The line was small, and the child had no recollection of learning it. Sillin watched the boy in the morning as he washed lichen from his hair and felt an unaccountable tremor. It was not fear as one might imagine, a pounding alarm, but a quieter contact, the electric prickle beneath the skin. The boy's eyes had an old look to them, as if a memory had passed through him like a bird leaving a feather. These small penetrations multiplied. A minor wraithguard reported that a construct she had tended let out a sound like laughter, an impossible human sound, before going still. A librarian discovered that a particular varnish used on old records had begun to delaminate in a pattern that spelled, when viewed under a microscope, a kind of sigil the workers had not taught. The song motifs, the varnish patterns, the construct sounds were all different in form but shared a quality. They were interpolations, insertions, tiny black threads in the fabric of the Craftworld's life. They were nothing and everything. Silen's daily life narrowed into a ritual of examination. He spent hours in the circuit's lower archives, listening to backthreads, following harmonics like a detective tracing footsteps in snow. He walked the terraces at odd hours, letting his ears attune to the scraping of broom on lichen and the faint heartbeat-like thud of distant machinery. He attended to children's lullabies, to the ways lovers paused at thresholds. With each observation, he added an entry to his private ledger. The geometric shape of a decal in the northern market, the precise pitch at which a voice cracked on a syllable, the angle of a hand when a sculptor paused. These were tiny things, and he wrote them because tiny things, if left unattended, become the architecture of catastrophe. Sleep became less restful. In his dreams, the infinity circuit spoke more plainly, unbidden, and the voices in the spirit stones layered over one another until they resembled not council but chorus. In those dreams, the circuit showed him palimpsests, a festival that had been painted over with a memorial, a lover's face superimposed on the face of a dead emperor. Sometimes the images were simple and cruel, a child playing on a street that no longer existed, the exact shape of a cupped hand that would never again hold a child's head. Each image faintly tasted of the warp. The warp's influence is not visible in the way some imagine. It is not smoke and claws. It is more likely to be a pause in a word, a fraction of a second in a mirrored reflection that does not align. On a fog-slow morning, Silen stood before a basin on a terrace and watched his face. He saw the familiar plane of his cheek and the sagging of a laugh line he had not yet earned. But beneath that, for a heartbeat, he saw another face, young, laughing with eyes full of a strange light. The image evaporated like a soap film. Silen felt, for the rest of the day, as if someone had touched his shoulder from behind. He made note of it. He logged the incident with the Guardians. They nodded the way one nods at weather reports. To most, the incidents would have remained dismissible. But in the culture of containment, dismissal is perilous. The act of ignoring a small thing sometimes hands it the cover it needs to grow. Silen recognized this and thus kept watching. As he watched, patterns emerged. Not all were malevolent in intention. Some were merely glitches in machinery. But a subset had the precision of intent behind them, as if an intelligence with taste and memory were selecting where to plant its seeds. The inserted motifs often bore the same harmonic signature, a particular interval that, when aired, tugged at the margins of desire. It was as if the warp had learned the language of their rituals and was speaking back with a voice reconstructed from their own cadences. What troubled Silen most was that the intrusions were not random. They appeared in places where longing had been recorded and stored. An old banquet hall's echo chamber, a lover's correspondence catalog, the registry of a funeral. The warp struck at the points of greatest tenderness. It was a cunning that felt personal. It was not merely seeking sensation. It was seeking the places where sensation had been practiced into pattern. There were other signs, more concrete. A squad of pathfinders returning from a survey of a derelict site reported that their wraithbone tools had reacted oddly. Etchings learned from the site had begun to spread through their tools like rust. Only the rust was an incised pattern that glowed faintly under starlight. Instruments caught the pattern. So did clothing. Even the sand in the ceremonial garden seemed to hold a micro-resonance that hummed when children jumped and laughed. Each artifact was like a drop of dye in the clear water of the craft world. Time would show how thoroughly the hue would spread. And so Scylan did what he had always done. He spoke slowly to those who might act. He called the weavers of ritual, the librarians of song, the wardens of data, the keepers of the stones. They met in a room whose walls were inlaid with the bones of ancient ships, and whose windows opened not to the stars, but to a private sky of filtered light. They spoke in the low voice of people trained to keep their lungs steady. The words they used were careful: local motifs, contamination vectors, harmonic residual. They planned wards, recalibration of rituals, limits on spirit stone consultations. They rewrote lullabies in carefully measured arcs so that the problematic intervals could not recur. They did what exiles do. They tightened the screws of survival. It helped for a while. A ward would stop the motif at a gate. A recalibrated hymn would not allow a particular cadence to appear. The circuit's logs showed fewer incursions. The children's lullabies returned to normal. The craftworks hummed with a relief like rain after a heat. Scylan slept briefly, but each time the defenses were raised, the warp learned another way to press. The psychological toll was precise and cumulative. The people of the craft world learned to live with the knowledge that their lives were, at any moment, open to a subtle intruder. They learned to be cautious with joy. Where once a single note of music could be allowed to swell into communal rapture, now the note was curtailed. Its release was regulated. Lovers spoke in parliaments. Artisans submitted designs to boards. Children learned to play games with fail-safe limits. The effect was survival, but it was also a slow eating away of the boldness that had made them who they were. Scylan watched all of this with the posture of a man whose job is to count losses and redistribute attention. He knew what restraint buys and what it takes. He has seen bright lives folded into timetables, loves pruned into manageable segments, songs tightened to the point where they were nearly clinically efficient. He witnessed how young people learned to smother the immediate delight in favor of long-term equilibrium. He mourned these things because he understood that they were a kind of living death, a constant defense against the shape of appetite. And yet he could not look away from the anomalies. Each incident told a story. Each insertion suggested an intelligence that was patient and adaptable. The warp was cunning not because it had force, but because it had memory, and memory learns the grammar of those it seeks. The infinity circuit had been built to catalog the past. The warp had learned to speak through the catalogs. It was a terrible apprenticeship of its own making. The Farseers' weariness turned, inevitably, to a specific dread, the sense of being watched. He had noticed it before on certain patrols, an odd turning of a head at a wrong angle, a child stopping mid-play and scanning a wall. But it had become more frequent, more deliberate. He felt it as a pressure at the nape of the neck, as if attentive eyes had settled there and would not be dislodged. In council, when he addressed the guardians, he found their gazes flickering to corners as if expecting to find a listener there. Conversations that had once been linear now moved as if in the presence of a third, invisible interlocutor. One night, when the sanctum was empty save for the slow pulse of a few distant wards, Scylan sat before the largest spirit stone bank and placed his palms upon the frames. He drew into himself, as he had been taught, the ancient meditation that unplugs one's mind from the immediate and lets the circuit run its course. He let his awareness soften and tuned, delicately, to the background resonance. He did not seek images but textures, patterns of attention. For a long time he was rewarded with nothing but the usual murmurs. A recipe recited, a child's name, a cautionary proverb. Then, like a thread pulled from the seam of a garment, a particular taste came through. Velvet, ice, the scent of a hall full of goblets. It was not memory that belonged to any one stone. It was diffuse, moving like a shadow through multiple echoes. He tried to focus on its origin. The circuit offered him slivers, an old memory of a banquet from a distant node, a lover's whisper from another registry, a pattern in the varnish files. Individually, they were innocuous. Together they created a contour that mapped horribly onto the original screen, an echo of an experience that had been amplified and then folded back into the Craftworld's archives. It felt like the warp tasting its own menu. Sillin withdrew, palms damp on the stone frames. The pressure at his neck intensified as if the watchfulness had noticed that he had noticed. He had the sense, then, that the Craftworld's wards were engaged in a conversation they could not entirely control. The enemy, or the force that moved like an enemy, was learning not simply the external shapes of ritual, but the internal grammar of restraint. It could walk the halls not by force but by mimicry. He rose and walked the long corridors, letting his staff tap softly at the floor. The scrape of the staff against Wraithbone made a thin sound that seemed to answer some distant note. At a crossway, a young guardian saluted and kept walking. Her fingers trembled ever so slightly. At the courtyard edge, a sculptor paused and smoothed a face until the light caught wrong on its cheek. The Craftworld held its breath. Sillin reached the terrace where the children sometimes played. The early light was thin. The lichen gave off a faint phosphorescent glow. A child with hair like spun frost played with a small toy, an animal carved from the leftover shavings of Wraithbone. The child turned and looked directly at Sillin, then laughed, an untouched, perfect laugh. It was the kind of laugh that could, in other circumstances, bloom into contagion, a note of joy across a plaza. Sillin felt the smallness of it like an ache. He watched the child for a long moment, then crouched and bent his head as if in private prayer. The child's face, for an instant, mirrored something older than itself, as if an image had drifted through the child's eyes and left a trace. The laugh ceased. He rose and continued. He felt watched. He knew he was being watched. The sensation was more than metaphor. An intelligence that preferred patient insertion over brute force, that preferred to sit like a needle at the seam and wait for the fabric to tear where it already weakened. He understood now what the elders had always feared, that their history, their acts of preservation, could be turned into a path back to the hunger. The war was no longer of blades but of echoes. He walked back into the sanctum and closed the doors. He set his staff beside him and, for the first time in an age of measured calm, allowed himself a fear that had not been catalogued. It was not panic. Panic in such a place would be contagious and useless. This was quieter, a cold accumulation at the base of his skull like a small stone settling in a river of thought. He felt the shape of what might come and knew it would not be loud. The horror would creep, and where it touched would be gilded, familiar, sung into being. The rot would be beautiful. Sillin made a decision then that he had delayed for too long. He would not only watch, he would map. He would follow the motifs, track the echolines, and begin to understand the grammar the warp now used. To do so, he would have to let himself be exposed to small things, the very danger he sought to prevent. It was a paradox that tasted like iron. He sat in the low light and wrote the first entry in a new ledger, on the nature of insertion, on patterns that mimic memory, on the whispering in reverse. He did not know how long he would be able to keep his mind clear if he followed such work closely. He only knew that someone had to do it. Outside, the Craftworld moved like a living cathedral through indifferent stars. Inside, the infinity circuit hummed. The spirit stones whispered. The wards glowed faintly. The small things maintained their order, and the children slept. But the air was different now in a way that could not be entirely warded. A sense that the beloved patterns of their lives had been read and were being recited back to them, in a voice that wanted them returned to the old appetite. Sillin set his pen down. He felt very clearly the watchfulness upon him, patient, cunning, and curiously precise. He would map the warp's new grammar, even if the mapping meant tasting small things more often than perhaps a healthy mind should. It was a dangerous work. It was necessary work. He folded his hands, closed his eyes, and listened once more to the hum beneath the floors, the infinity circuit's slow, heartbeat-like thud. In the circuit's murmur he thought he heard, almost as if in a dream, a line of music that was certainly familiar and not familiar all at once. a melody that might, in another life, have meant comfort. But now, playing just beneath the melody was a whisper in reverse. He had mapped the seams. He had counted the motifs, traced the reverse echoes, stitched wards where the Craftworld skin had thinned. That work had been slow and patient and useful. But there is a difference between knowing the edge of a wound and walking into the wound to see how deep it goes. So Sillin went down. He took with him no company save for a thin lantern that hummed at a pitch complementary to the infinity circuit, and an old, crooked knife, used more as a pointer than a blade. He closed the wards behind him and descended through levels of archive the general populace rarely visited, sublevels where the circuit's threads braided into one another like roots, where obsolete protocols lay folded like the skins of dead insects, where the hum of data became thick and tactile. The air grew cooler, or perhaps it only felt cooler because he was moving away from the sunlit terraces into a place where memory itself pooled. At first, the descent was a navigation of code and ritual. He unhooked nodes, soothed jealous subroutines with minor compensations, read the provenance of a motif to the place it had been first stored. Each node had a voice and a face, an emblem, a registered calendar of use, an IP of a composer long buried. He spoke softly to each, naming its keeper, acknowledging the small life that had fed it. There was a discipline to this. The human mind misreads the warp when given a pedestal of vanity and listenership. Sillin kept his voice low as lace, so his tone could not be mistaken for appetite. But as he went deeper, the faces multiplied and the architecture shifted. The infinity circuit, once a precise lattice, stretched into corridors of light that did not always obey Euclidean rules. Paths curved back upon themselves and double-backed. Nodes that had been sealed for centuries pulsed awake and coughed up fragments of festivals no living soul should remember. The archives sprouted flowers of sound. A single file would bloom into a chorus of images that poured into one another with the logic of a dream. He crossed halls where the echoes of a billion lives overlapped. It was no mere metaphor. They're the circuit's storage philosophies, designed to maximize fidelity, had accidentally layered, and the resulting palimpsest was a pressure chamber. Sillin walked through 100 kitchens at once, smelled stew from 10 planets, felt the warmth of a murky hearth, and layered over it the chill of a tomb. Laughter stacked upon sorrow until he could not tell which was the primary. Time lost its linearity. Memory folded into memory and then folded again until the past existed as a present with the insistence of thunder. Something there listened back. It had voice, not one voice but a chorus and a modulation. It spoke in tones that felt like hands on the back of the neck. It did not call itself by name. It offered impressions. A hand smoothing a chord, a taste of bright metal at the tongue, a suggestion of a smile at the edge of the sky. The infinity circuit had been designed to archive life. This presence had learned to tap those archives and play them as an instrument. Sillin moved toward a node marked simply, Sanctuary 5, Spirit Stone Vault. The path there was not a straight one. Files he had thought irretrievable unspooled ahead of him like a procession. Visions of lovers he had never known, statues whose lips moved in a language he almost understood, the exact weight of a coin from a market on a dead world. Each vision left a residue, like a perfume clinging to air. He bunched them mentally, tried to file them under evidence, but they pressed at him with the intimacy of a hand inside a glove. When he reached the vault, the doors were not shut as he had expected. They were breathing. The frames of the entrance, worked with wards and prayer runes, flexed minutely as if inhaling. The spirit stones within shone with a cold, slow light, the kind that suggests the light remembers heat. He set down his lantern and moved among them the way a doctor moves among patients, touched the brow of one, listened to the murmur of another, read the throb of a third. The stones had been his allies. They had been repositories of counsel and consolation for generations. How easy, he thought with a prick of shame, to let a tool become a tether. His hand found one stone whose faceting held a memory he had never before permitted himself to examine. The recording of the last hymn the Eldar sang as jubilation turned to something else. He had seen fragments of that hymn before, offered in corners and distorted through the circuit's insistence, but never the whole. He lifted the stone into the lantern's light and the memory poured out like river water uncorked. The vision was not cinematic only, it was visceral. He felt the press of bodies, the taste of wine heavy with a spice that made the mouth bloom, the exact temperature of a lamp's flame against skin. The music, oh the music, was a lattice of harmonics tuned so perfectly it made the joints of the body ache with pleasure. The crowd's intake of breath became a single instrument. For the first time, the pattern he had been trying to name revealed its purpose. It was not mere pleasure that had torn their species. It was the achievement of a collective pitch, a unanimity of sensation so exact that it shattered the membrane of the living mind and bled outward. Within that fissure, something moved and learned. What Scylan observed then was not a god descending like a storm, but the warp answering in a way that was intimate, surgical. Out of the scream that followed, the scream that had rippled through Eldar minds across the Empire, came an intelligence that fed on continuity and pattern. It did not devour only bodies, it ate syntax. In the vault the stones shook as if struck. The cries of the dead, once muted counsel, spooled into pleading, a layering that made his own chest ache with the impossible empathy of someone listening to a child beg for a toy. The stone's light dimmed and brightened, not in haphazard flutter but in modulation. They pulsed in concert. Each pulse sounded, to Scylan, as if it were sending a syllable into an immense mouth. The truth found him there, and it arrived with the clarity of a blade. Every soul within the Craftworld fed her. Not in the crude sense of sacrifice upon altars, but in the slow, secret economy of memory and longing. The spirit stones, the instruments meant to protect souls from obliteration, had become cues in a ledger. Their preserved voices were channels. They did not merely store the dead, they offered the warp a menu. Each recorded grief, each catalogued longing, each perfectly preserved lullaby became, in time, a filament through which the warp could soothe itself and then demand more. Scylan felt his stomach cold. He sat on the floor, the lantern's light painting his knuckles with paper pallor. He could hear the circuit groan deeper than a machine. It sounded like the whole Craftworld inhaling to sing. The idea spread in him like frost. Salvation had been an illusion. Spirit stones were not beacons that led the dead away. They were mirrors in which the hunger practiced how to call them back. He had to move. He had to trace the thread to its source. He fought through levels of protected record, nurseries encoded in harmonic lattices, banquet registers encrypted in ceremonial chords, funeral transcriptions indexed by time and place. Each protective layer unfurled another memory, another little home the warp could use. The circuit resisted him like an old animal disturbed from sleep. Subroutines that had behaved impeccably now hiccuped. Files that had been stable for centuries replayed with faint artifacts. The deeper he went, the more the circuit mirrored his own confusion, playing modified versions of files as if to test him. It threw up images that soothed and then, before he could steady himself, pierced him with a wrongness that felt like fingernails at the back of the mind. And then the echoes were everywhere, the echoes of a billion lives, all screaming at once. The phrase was truer than any metaphor. The palimpsest had detonated into a cathedral of sound. Faces, places, ways of touching and tasting and grieving multiplied and remultiplied, until the circuit itself could not tell which line belonged to which owner. The warp had taught the archives how to sing back their contents in a way that made the living reach toward them, and the dead plead to be complete. Scylan staggered. He had expected revelation. He had not expected the sensation of drowning in other people's endings. He tried to steady himself by naming, calling out the names associated with a file, the provenance of a hymn, the date stamped on a child's toy. Names were anchors, but the names blurred. They were like candles put together until their smoke became one thick veil. Something touched the edge of his mind then, not with a hand but with a sound, a warmth behind the eyes, a breath at the nape, a smile that lay beneath the stars like a secret stone. He did not see a face. He felt the impression of a presence that knew the nook of his heart more intimately than any friend. It had learned where his comforts were kept, his mother's lullaby, the exact cadence that could make him close his eyes, and it played them like levers. The circuit, which had once offered counsel, now offered temptation. He tried to turn away. The deeper he fled, the tighter the glissando of voices followed. He reached nodes that contained rituals meant to sever attachment, a rite designed to dull an urge, a ceremony to burn an image to ash. But the warp had anticipated such measures. In the recordings they were cut short, an extra beat missing, a line of a prayer reversed. The rituals, once tools of containment, had been re-edited into keys. The floor under him seemed to move. Wraithbone panels flexed, and a hairline fissure opened in the wall of a corridor like the first split in a shell. From that fissure a darkness bled, a texture not of lack but of pattern, like oil spreading across clean water. Tendrils of it crept along the edges of a spirit stone's facet, curling and tasting at the light. Where they licked the crystal, the light went dull, and from the dulled facets issued not counsel but a sweet, pleading mutter. Give, finish, return. The tendrils were not properly shadow. They had edges like embroidery, the kind of ornament that suggested hands. Scylan tried to pull back, but the tendrils hooked at the hem of his robe, and in them he found a speaking, an imitation of memory that grew and molded on contact. The tendrils tasted a name, and then whispered that name back in a key that made the nails of his hands ache. The circuit began to mirror his panic, replaying his own fear in harmonics. He felt as if he were inside a hollow instrument, and the outer world was vibrating it. He staggered through more halls until he reached an image he had not expected. The Craftworld itself, observed from a point in the warp that made it look small and slow and terrible. It revolved like a weathered planet. Around it, like an orbit of unseen satellites, were threads of resonance, filaments that reached out into the dark like radial fingers. He saw, with a clarity that made his lungs thin, that those filaments were not searching empty space but something, a pattern the warp had shaped into a locus. It was not simply that Slaanesh waited on the edges. It was that the Craftworld had anchored itself around her. The exile was not a flight line. It was an orbit. The image took the breath from him. The Craftworld's long voyage had not been a line of escape, but a circumnavigation around a presence that preferred to be near and not close, near enough to taste the preserved voices, near enough to press its impression across fabrics of memory without ever being seen. The Eldar had, in the act of preservation, made themselves into a wheel that turned in the circle of the hunger. Every spirit stone, every archive, every carefully preserved lullaby became a spoke that the warp could touch. Their sanctuaries were not refuges but larders. He understood at last the terrible logic. The warp did not need to strike a swift, devastating blow. It needed a slow economy. It would make lovers recall their earliest, purest touch, and then amplify that touch until the mind mistook old solace for new necessity. It would take the dead's unfinished phrases and wind them into a chord that dragged the living back into indulgence. It would teach itself the grammar of their restraint and then speak with their accent. The Craftworld's salvation was a scaffold that the warp used to learn how to ask for more. The revelation shattered his carefully trained reticence. Words tumbled from him in a ragged litany. He tried to send an alarm through the circuit to flag nodes to trigger a purge. For a moment the system complied. Red lights blinked, wards flared. But the warp had anticipated alarm as surely as it had anticipated ritual. The purge attempted to take hold, and found itself rerouted into a soft channel that folded the alarm into an aria that soothed instead of stung. His warning became, in the archive's playback, a new melody that matched the cadence of the old hymns. He felt his voice, steady and once authoritative, begin to fracture, and then his voice began to multiply. He found his phrase repeated back at him in harmonics, each iteration slightly delayed, slightly out of phase. The calm narrative he had cultivated became repetition and then pleading. He tried to command himself, stop, but the circuit, now a chorus, turned stop into an echo that begged instead. Stay, continue, remember. His sentence split into 1,000 little pleas, like beads breaking from a necklace and rolling into cracks in the floor. He went on anyway. He followed the orbited filaments deeper into the warp vision, and through corridors of mirror light where faces that might have been his or might have been someone else's looked askance from portraits that had never existed. Each step further unhooked him from linear selfhood. For a moment, he remembered another life in which he had been young and reckless, and had danced in a hall being carefully archived now as a cautionary tale. He smelled the wine he had never drunk and felt its warmth as if it had been a medicine applied to an old wound. He could not say whether he was learning the warp's grammar or it was learning his. The tendrils thickened. They braided themselves into cords that looped through the arches and into the vaults where spirit stones nested. There they wrapped around facets and drew light like a net draws fish. Souls within the stones shimmered as if touched by a cold hand, and in the shimmer the preserved echoes changed pitch. A lullaby's soft descent suddenly hung longer at the bottom. A funeral dirge's cadence smoothed into a caress. The voice of the warp was modeling completion into each fragment, hinting at endings the dead had been denied. The stones answered with a tiny sound that was both grateful and hungry. Sillin felt bile rise. He had thought the stones were mercy. Now he knew them to be vectors. He thought of the children sleeping above, of the guardians who polished armor with ritual precision, of lovers who measured their hands' pressure as if the right force might keep them safe. All of their carefulness had built a lattice that the warp could pluck like strings. He tried to cut the cords. He traced them back to a node of low visibility and found, woven within the data, a motif of exquisite subtlety, a reverse phrase that when played forward produced a melancholy but harmless comfort. When read backward, it resolved into a command that eased the mind's resistance. The warp had become a composer, learning counterpoint by applying pressure at the exact nodes where their culture had taught them to feel most. He severed the motif with an old ritual blade and burned the file in the circuit's slow furnaces. For a moment, like a fever broken, the air cleared. But the clearance was temporary. The economy of hunger had other markets. The warp had not placed all its eggs in one file. It had seeded patterns across centuries of recordings and across the very shapes of their rituals. To remove one thread left a gap that the warp happily filled with a variation. Sillin's voice, which had been steady as a bell, began to shatter. He found himself narrating fragments of the truth as if trying to teach an audience that might no longer be wholly present. "We are not being hunted," he said aloud to the empty vault. "We orbit." He repeated the word over and over until the syllables frayed. Each repetition was taken up by the circuit and recited back in a cadence that made the admission sound like a prayer. The more he insisted, the more the circuit made his confession into a chorus that smoothed the edges of reality. His mind did not collapse in a single instant. It eroded like shoreline, little bites of identity taken day after day until the shape left looked unfamiliar. He began to find his own gestures doubled in other hands in the archives. He saw his laugh reflected in a recording of a court jester, and for a moment believed it to be his past. He felt the Craftworld's long solitude press in, and somewhere within that weight, the warp learned to be tender. At last, at the center of a node that might have been an altar or might have been nothing more than a corrupted registry, Sillin found an image that resolved with perfect cruelty. A mirror held up in the void that showed the Craftworld circling an absence, a negative whose gravity was the lure of completion. The orbiting was not a metaphor but a geometrical fact. The Craftworld's exile had been an elliptical path that kept it close enough to be tasted, but distant enough to remain a prison. His voice splintered into sound and plea and repeated petition. For a while the circuit replayed him and gave him back his own fear as a lullaby. In that fractured song, he understood the final cruelty. The Eldar were not being punished by a god who delighted in their pain, nor merely consumed by an insatiable appetite. They had engineered the scaffold of their own undoing by preserving everything they loved with such fidelity that a hunger could learn to speak in their voice. Sillin let himself slide to the floor among the stones. He felt the tendrils brush his cheek as if to comfort. He felt the warmth behind the eyes again and the memory of a smile that could have been mercy. The circuit hummed and the spirit stones whispered. Around him the palimpsest sang. Orbiting, he whispered once more, and the word came back to him as a choir. He thought of the children. He thought of the guardians. He thought of the thin pleasures the elders allowed themselves, measured and slow. He thought of the ledger he had kept all his life, the notes in his margin, and how writing them had been an attempt to keep a thing whole by naming it. The ledger lay open in his lap, and the ink ran as if weeping. Somewhere high above the vault, in the artificial gardens, a bell chimed the hour. Its sound was small and ordinary, and for a fleeting instant, it was as if the world were anything but a music lesson in how to desire. Sillin reached out and touched the stone nearest him. Its surface was cold, and when he pressed his forehead to it, the circuit offered him one more image. A child asleep in a cradle, the faint line of a smile in the half-sleep of a dream, and beyond that child a hand, not his nor hers, but a tentative, dark-curved shape touching the cradle's edge. He pulled away and felt an answering pressure at the base of the skull, a private tightening that might have been fear or might have been attention. His voice, which had become repetition and that repetition a plea, softened into something else, a record. He began to write, slow and deliberate, in a hand that refused to smooth. He could not repair all. He could not hope to stop a hunger that had learned grammar from his people's culture, but he could leave traces. If the Craftworld was in orbit, then perhaps a map might help one child stitch a different course. If the warp had learned their grammar, then perhaps a grammar of resistance might be taught back. His pen made a thin, trembling line across the page. He wrote until his hands cramped. He wrote confessions and instructions and warnings. He wrote names and small songs that contained a closure at their end, a cadence that could not be reversed into appetite. He wrote with the claustrophobic precision of someone who must make meaning before the meaning is reshaped for another appetite. Outside, the orbit continued, silent, indifferent as a planet's path. Within, the circuit hummed and the stones whispered. Tendrils of velvet shadow curled and receded, tasting and learning where they could. Sillin's voice had broken into shards, and those shards sang in the archives as new motifs. He could not be certain whether his ledger would be a spur or a map for the hunger. He could not be certain of anything beyond the immediate sensation, that the Craftworld was no flight but a turn around a ruin, and that their preservation had been the very method of their binding. When he finally rose, his limbs were unsteady, and his mind a little thin on edges. He wrapped his cloak about his shoulders and set his lantern upon the nearest stone. The gems pulsed once, as if offering a benediction. He took a breath and felt the warmth behind his eyes like a hand. A whisper, soft and almost kind, sifted through the hall. He could not tell whether it was an invitation or a benediction. He walked upward through the winding corridors, following the long ladder of light that would lead to the terraces. As he ascended, fragments of his voice kept rising behind him from the lower archives. Repetitions, half-pleas, an echo that might yet be guidance. He thought then of orbit and of the smallness of motions that seem like escape but are in fact circuits. He thought of the children's laughter, now layered with an aftertaste. He thought of the ledger in his pocket, its pages damp from his sweat, and the words inked with the particular courage of someone who knows a truth others find unbearable. He emerged into air that smelled faintly of lichen and lamprezen. The terraces were dim, and the gardens ticked with tiny green sounds. A child rolled a toy across a stepping stone, and the toy's shadow seemed to move with a not quite right delay. The stars overhead were indifferent. The Craftworld followed its course. Sillin paused and looked out toward the break in the sky where, beyond the velvet, all things are exact and indifferent. The warp's presence was not visible there, not with eyes that measured starlight, but he felt its circumference like the pull of a distant moon. He understood now what exile had been, not a refusal of the old world, but a negotiation with its hunger that the elders had never fully comprehended. He folded his ledger into his cloak and placed it in a slot in the vault, anonymously, under a rune he alone remembered. Perhaps someone would find it and learn. Perhaps it would be merely another file the circuit would sing and the warp would taste. He could not know. What he knew was the geometry of their binding. They orbited a thing instead of fleeing it. Sillin breathed, slow and ragged. He felt the Craftworld breathe with him, an organism with a heartbeat compromised by an inhabitant's hunger. He thought of the elders who had designed spirit stones as mercy, and of the children who would inherit their measures. He thought, too, that the horror revealed was not solely the warp's doing. It was the inevitable arithmetic of preserving everything you love with a fidelity so hot that something else could read the recipe. He turned and walked back into the vault. The spirit stones glowed, the circuit hummed, and somewhere in the deep archive a motif repeated, soft and sweet and hungry. The night settled like a hand. He could feel the warmth close at his eyes again, a velvet pressure that suggested comfort and contained a lesson. Sillin laid his palm on the nearest stone and spoke, not to it but through it, to those who might one day listen. "Remember," he said, and the word became a thread that wound through the archways. "Remember that we orbit. Remember what we made and what it made of us." His voice fractured and repeated, and the passion of it, an honest, broken thing, was both a plea and a map. He did not know whether the plea would be read as warning or sung back as lullaby. He only knew that the Craftworld held its course, turning in the dark as if praying, and that the thing at the center of that course was patient, tender, and learning the cadence of the Eldar until all their songs could be answered back with a smile. The ship goes on, because ships of bone and light have no other habit than motion. When you have been built to drift, you drift. The Craftworld continues its slow negotiation with the dark, turning its long face to indifferent stars, trimming its courses against gravity wells and eddies of void, as if steering were a kind of prayer. In the days after Sillin's descent, life resumed the cadence the Eldar preferred, measured, deliberate, practiced. Yet the cadence carried a new weight, an invisible weight that bent gestures, dimmed jokes at their edges, taught hands to pull back a fraction before a touch could become an invitation. Sillin walked the terraces again. He moved among families who wrapped their children's small hands in ritual bands, among artisans who hammered with fewer jubilant strikes and more precise repetitions, among guardians whose eyes swept and rested as if testing the air. He watched the young recite their lessons on restraint and heard, beneath their clear voices, the rustle of anxiety. He watched the old polished relics that had been polished 1,000 times and felt the thinness in their ritual. The Craftworld's beauty had not abandoned them. If anything, it was more exact, more attentive to finish. But everything that was finished carried the memory of the fissures that had once opened in its seams. The infinity circuit hummed as always, soft, unavoidable, intimate. Yet now it hummed with cautions woven into its notes. The harmonics that had once been used to cradle a memory were now also used to bind it with a closing cadence, an engineered termination point that, when executed correctly, could prevent a lodged motif from being played back into temptation. The engineers spoke of closure keys with the dry language of technicians who have been forced into a pastoral vocation. Their work was precise and little celebrated. The good of it showed only as the absence of a disaster, unseen, uncongratulated. Spirit Stone sanctums remained full. The stones still shone with the cold clarity of dawn glass, and there were mornings when elders would move through the rows and weep, not with a loud grief, but with the tiny collapses of someone who feels the cost of preservation as a constant pulling at the ribs. The stones offered counsel, yes. They offered, too, the echo of the hunger that had learned to use those echoes. The paradox did not resolve. It lived, stubborn as a scar, as something to be tended every day. The whispers did not stop. They had never been loud to begin with. They were threaded into the fabric of living there the way moss threads into stone. After the purge attempts and the wards and the new closures, the Warp's voice changed tactics. It scoured the archives, yes, but it also learned quieter arts. How to sit in a pause, how to make a long silence feel like attention, how to place a note of ache precisely where a heart expects a lullaby. It used hesitation as invitation. Where once it had tried to shock and overwhelm, it now preferred to be patient and to appear helpful. A half-remembered phrase in a child's mouth would be all it needed to reopen a channel the elders had thought sealed. The technique was small breaches compounded over time. Scylan noticed the change not in any single incident, but in the slow tilting of the world toward a brittle vigilance. People smiled less with the abandon of youth. Lovers touched with instruments of ritual in their pockets, tiny notations, tiny safeguards, so that each gesture could be undone if it began to sing too keenly. Artisans embedded canceling motifs into their works, a line of shadow at the end of a poem, a closing chord that sealed feeling into a shape that could not be rerun. They became, in their creativity, engineers of restraint. The beautiful things they made had locks on them, an aesthetic that ended with a hinge. The children, always the clearest measure of a culture's health, stepped lightly. Teachers taught them songs that resolved to a chord that could not be reversed into appetite. Playtime was bounded by small rituals. A toy was allowed for 3 minutes and then placed under a glass until the next measured hour. Games of mock feast were enacted with simulated food that could not be tasted. It is a practical way to preserve young minds, but the method leaves its own shadow. A childhood that learns to savor with a stopwatch. And yet there were transgressions. Small ones, mostly. A father humming a band interval while he drew a child's blanket tighter. An old woman in a back alley who took a single, forbidden draft meant to remind her of a lost lover. These acts were brief and secret, but their existence tended to remind everyone that the hunger could still be tempted, so long as temptation was met with shame, and then with a ritual of repair. The social fabric tightened, and in the tightening there were new seams. Scylan's ledger lay where he had hidden it, beneath the worn stone of a bench in the vault. Occasionally someone would come across the thin packet of pages and read. He could not know how many times his notes would be interpreted as cautionary script, warnings, maps for survival, or, perversely, as new motifs for the warp. He felt the tension of that possibility as a kind of guilt. To preserve was to risk transmission. To record was to risk being read incorrectly. His last entries were crude and careful at once. Lists of patterns to avoid, instructions for closure keys, lines of a lullaby written so that its last note could not be reversed. He had written as if his words might be both artifact and antidote. There were nights when Scylan would find himself walking alone on the terrace, listening to the hum as if it were a living thing in pain. He watched the wraithwood flex and the gardens glow in the hush of artificial dusk. He placed his palm on the stone and thought of the dead whose voices lived locked in glass. There were no easy absolutions. The best he could offer himself, and those who might come after, was a practice of small, relentless repair. To notice, to record, to close, to teach a child a different cadence. The craft world, for all its slow doom, retained dignity. There were moments of real, dangerous beauty. An old poet composing a new lament that closed not with a yearning but with an acceptance. A guardian who, after a long watch, allowed herself a full laugh, and then made the necessary confession and ritual to wash the note. These acts were not failures of vigilance, but exercises in the organism's complexity. The Eldar had not become automatons. They remained beings capable of risk because they were alive. The point of survival for them was not to become unfeeling, but to hold feeling in ways that prevented predation. Every day, guardians and weavers and engineers worked on the thin edges of their culture, writing closure keys, training young voices in safe intervals, building wards that did not themselves sing in the wrong way. They argued with the infinity circuit and with each other about how much to preserve and how much to let decay. Sometimes they decided incorrectly and learned. Sometimes they lost a motif that had been important and had to create a new ritual to hold the loss. Their lives became an economy of small choices, each one bearing the potential to shift the orbit inward or outward by a fraction. Still, the orbit remained. The revelation that the Craftworld had been circling the hunger was a geometrical truth that did not unwind with culture or ceremony. They could adjust their habits, but they could not change the fundamental fact that their preservation effort existed in a universe in which the warp could read the ledger. The elders had sewed nets to catch the danger. The warp learned to recognize the stitching and to tug at the threads that would not cause the net to break but would cause it to sing. Sylvan preferred, eventually, to tell that truth in small doses. He spoke in quiet gatherings where children and elders listened. He explained, without the rage that might harden into despair, that their exile had become an ellipse, an orbit of necessity and hazard, and that survival would be ongoing, not final. He was careful with his metaphors, for metaphors teach pattern, and patterns could be learned by the wrong ears. He used the language of craft. Tighten here, loosen there. Place a stop where once you placed a start. He taught how to make a song that folded closed on itself. He instructed children in a bedtime cadence that included an unplayable end, a silent beat that could not translate into appetite. His teaching was an act of stewardship. He knew the stakes. He also knew that fear without practice becomes paralysis. The elders encouraged ritual, not hysteria. In the places where hysteria took root, the warp found more openings. Panic scatters wards and leaves bodies vulnerable. Calmness, practiced and informed, made the covenant of restraint effective. And yet the whispers persisted. You could hear them if you listened for their edges. A half-hummed line of old jubilation in a market, an odd varnish pattern on a newly made toy, a delay in a reflection. Sometimes they were nothing but the ship's ordinary acoustic quivers. Sometimes they were the warp, tasting and learning. The difference was not always obvious. That was the true cruelty of it, ambiguity as a weapon. You could not always tell when you needed a ward or when you needed to let something alone. To decide wrongly could be costly. People adjusted. They learned to repair not only the ship but themselves. They made ritual of confession and cleansing, of sanctioned indulgences in which a small, controlled pleasure was allowed and then properly closed. They invented new aesthetic constraints that functioned like social antibodies. In those inventions, there was also a reclaiming. The Eldar turned their terrible refinement into a tool of survival. They had always been artisan people. Now they reinvented craft as containment. The artistry continued, but with a new ethical axis. Sylvan aged into his role as a teacher of caution. He no longer sought revelatory depths in the circuit. He used it as a classroom for careful rehearsal. He would set a motif before a group and teach them to finish it with the designed cadence. He taught ward makers to be invisible in their craft. He trained listeners to notice the difference between a benign echo and an insertion. His own life narrowed not because the world demanded less of him, but because he chose to funnel his energies into the practical, into the making of safeties, into the sewing of small closures across the cultural cloth. There were quiet days that felt like small victories, a lullaby that did not trigger an incursion, a new toy design that could not be reprocessed into appetite, a ward that held a motif without letting it loop. These triumphs were minimal and private, but in a culture that needed to survive incrementally, a private success mattered immeasurably. They were proof that adaptation could work, that the warp's patient learning could be met with patient redesign. Still, in his private hours, Sylvan felt the old dread settle in like a weather front on the horizon. The Craftworld's path did not change. The warp learned. New motifs would be sown. The infinity circuit would remember and the spirit stones would murmur. And sometimes the murmur would be a plea that tasted like mercy. That taste was the most dangerous of all, mercy as pretext. He had seen it once when he descended, and he knew its warmth behind the eyes, its breath at the nape. He could not be certain that any ritual could fully bar it forever, but certainty had never been the point. Their survival would be a matter of practice and attention, of small closures and honest reckonings. They would keep their craft, their songs, their rituals. They would temper them with restraint and teach their children new closures. They would be beautiful and cautious, proud and humble. The craft world drifted onward, beautiful and doomed perhaps, but not wholly surrendered. There was a dignity in that half-surrender, the refusal to become stone-faced automatons, the choice instead to be alive with eyes open to the danger. The whispers never stop. They are part of the fabric now. The hum under the floors, the micro-delay in a reflection, the soft rustle of a spirit stone's edge. They will be there in the years to come, folded into lullabies and woven into the cadence of artisans at their benches. They will be there as something to be monitored, as a condition of living in a species that refused either oblivion or denial. Sillin passed on his ledger in parts and fragments. Some pages were read and then rehidden. Others were used as templates for safe motifs. He taught as best he could, and then, in an act that was both humble and defiant, he let the children teach him back. The new rhythms, the new closures, the innovations that surprise elders and become tools. The greatest hope for their future was not a single cure, but the continuity of practice, an unbroken chain of attention held in generations. In the end, his acceptance was not a capitulation. It was a recognition of the scale of their task and the narrowness of their options. He learned to live with the knowledge that the preservation that saved them was also the scaffold of their binding. He learned to hold beauty like a fragile beast that must be fed carefully, and then put back in its pen. And so, in the hush after his last public lesson, Sillin would sometimes sit upon the terrace and look out into the indifferent dark. He would listen to the infinity circuit's low, steady hum and the quiet scraping of a broom somewhere down in the lower wards. He would note the tiny, secret laughter that occasionally slipped through a closed door and remember why preservation mattered even if it made them vulnerable. He felt always the weight of the ledger in his mind, the lines he had drawn, the maps he had offered. He felt also the softness of a world that moved on, carrying them with it. Even in the silence, something stirs. Even in the light, shadows move. They are still watching. Even in the dark, they're waiting.